Greetings, students. Bear with me as I get ready to go into our next video lecture. Today, we're going to be exploring chapter 15, and we're going to be exploring enhancing family functioning relationships. So a mainstay in your individuals and families course, in that one of the major objectives in this particular course is for you to learn and demonstrate the ability to actually work with family. So some very important concepts that we're going to share here in terms of how do we actually improve these family relationships and families functioning. So bear with me as we move forward. All right, so we need to think about the initial contact. So managing these initial contacts between couples and families. So, as we know that initial time that you're connecting with the individuals and the families are really crucial. It's about really understanding whether there are current safety concerns, especially when you're doing contacts in the home. Oftentimes, most social workers find it quite advantageous to actually do the initial contact in the home because it gives you some idea of what day-to-day life might be like within the context of that family by just being in that environment. It just feels more natural, and people tend to be a little bit more responsive when they are home as opposed to maybe in a different facility or different site. Also making sure that we manage these initial contacts with parents, because oftentimes when you've got families, you've got sometimes kids that are a part of the problem or kids that are a part of the family system, and that might be presenting or a part of some of the issues that might be happening with the family. So it's really about establishing a good rapport with the family, helping them understand why it is you're there, and that you're partnering with them in terms of looking at what the family's issues are. Coaching parents, so giving them tips and tidbits as they are guiding other members of the families through this particular process. Establish the concerns as a family concern, because oftentimes one particular or two particular people might be targeted in the family as the troublemakers, so to speak. But if we start to think about framing and understand that particular behavior that we might be seeing from a few individuals, we really usually understand that it's a much more complex piece of behavior that's really driven by things that are happening within the context of the family. As well as creating safe space for the children and allowing children to tell their story. I mean, it's a perspective matter in terms of being able to understand it from everybody's point of view. So these next few slides really look at how you set up and orchestrate that particular initial family session. So personal relationships with individual members, really clarifying the expectations, and exploring the reservations about the helping process. You don't know why you're here, what it is you're exactly going to do. So I think being transparent and clear as you're moving forward in terms of your work definitely will help. And then also really understanding the role that culture plays in this, because different families from different parts of the world have different culture and different family configurations. So they might view assistance from outsiders a little bit differently. So be sure that you clarify what it is you're here to do and what it is you're attempting to do. Clarifying the roles of the helping process, making sure that people are participating in that process, and really trying to get a sense of understanding, as you do in all assessments, what's the problem from the perspective of the people who are actually experiencing it, because that really helps us look at that and then really kind of see where the family would want to go as it relates to, once we've identified clearly what that is, and having the family really define what the problems are, as opposed to us as the practitioners intervening with the family. Always emphasize family strengths. Oftentimes families who have been struggling with issues for quite some time will have gotten to a place where they don't see that there are any real strengths that are happening within the context of the families. Relationships are damaged, or interactions are just really painful and hard and difficult. And so it's hard sometimes in the midst of all of that to be able to actually acknowledge that there are some good things that are happening in families. So it's really about, understanding and highlighting that particular piece. If people are working and taking care of each other, People spend time with each other. People celebrate various holidays. At the end of the day, whether we are fighting or arguing, we have each other's back. I will keep you protected. I will keep these different things going. Kids might be having a really great time at school in terms of being able to progress. Financially, you might be stable. So there are a number of strengths. I think that it's important for us as practitioners working with families to really be able to go in and highlight, because again, those oftentimes get lost in times of high stress. We want to get some information about the patterns of behavior that people are seeing. We want to look at and pay attention to the communication and seeing whether there's a real buying into really wanting things to be different. That might come after a few sessions. Begin to actually help people communicate with each other in much more positive ways. Oftentimes, things have been at such a bad place for such a long time until the standard mode of communication might be openly hostile. And we need to really be able to back people away from that and really give them some different ways to connect with each other. Because if we keep doing or we keep allowing the same types of interactions to happen, we'll continue to get the same types of results. So really doing some training and some educating around some different ways to say things or to approach people. Gauge motivation. How motivated is this family to move forward, and then negotiate tasks. What are some things that we can do given that things that we've learned this week? What are some small steps or some small goals or some small tasks that people can be involved in over the course of the week until we get back together next week to see if we actually try to do some things different, would it actually make a difference? And then summarizing. I think it's really important that at the end or coming to the end of your session, that you summarize all of the things that you have talked about, the highlights, the main points, what you heard, because it gives people the impression, well, it does two things actually. It gives you the opportunity to learn if there were things that you missed that the family feel like is important because they can add that. And it also demonstrates that you're actually tuned into what's happening for that particular family and you're really paying attention. So just really good attending skills are needed and you're orchestrating these sessions. Also intervening and looking at the cultural and ecological considerations. So recognizing that difference in communication styles. So depending on the type of family that you're working with, depending on their ethnic background, where they come from, how long they've been in the country, how acculturated they are, will have some impact in terms of communications. In some particular cultures, gender roles are very, very defined and specific. And so we could often misinterpret things if we looked at it through our own lens or what might be happening for us in the United States. So we need to be real clear about trying to have some source of understanding. And it's probably even a good idea before you actually go out to work with a family in which you have very little familiarity, is to actually do some research, is to really look at what methods, what methodologies in terms of social work have been successful with these types of families before, as well as if you've got colleagues or coworkers who may be of that particular culture, to really get some insights from them before actually even going out. So just some things to keep in mind and to consider. Also helping them understand the authority of the social worker, because in different cultures, professionals are viewed differently in terms of their authority. And so you may not get often honest input from people if they're not clear about what your role is and what your role is not. So thinking about that, how you would engage the families. Some families really place a high value on food and spending time with each other. So to enter into that family dynamic, food might be offered to you in terms of a way of connecting. And that might be something that can actually help enhance the family relationship, and understanding the family, pretty much using this ecological approach, looking at things from the perspective of how's the family in the world that they live in, the neighborhoods that they live in, the places that they visit, all the things that might be in their eco map in terms of those things as well too. Intervening with families also in terms of focusing on the future. So using solution-focused techniques. And so we talked about that, I think maybe probably last class, where we were looking at different types of change-oriented approaches and really asking some questions. I think a lot of times, if families aren't able to see where it is they want to go and want to be, then it's going to be hard for them to get there. So these two questions, scaling questions and miracle questions, are ways to really kind of get at helping people visualize what the future could be like in a more positive term. So, if everything in this particular family was working the way it was supposed to and people were getting along, what would that look like? And we can identify what those kind of things would look like. And then working backwards from there, we can figure out what are the steps that we need to actually put in place and the resources to make sure that we get to that miracle question answer at some point. And then scaling is really just a way of really looking at the intensity and the frequency of what's happening within the context of the family. So on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being things are absolutely horrible and 1 being things are absolutely great, where do you see this particular problem lying on that scale? And maybe I'd ask that individually from all of the members in the family to get a good sense of how people are actually viewing things. So just some techniques to think about. And then also focusing on the exceptional times to determine what works and why. So there have been times that families have not always been in crisis, I guess. And so helping them recognize that there have been times that might be similar to what they're experiencing now, and what were some of the things that helped them get through some of those difficult times. So really to be mindful in terms of being able to elicit as much information as you can as it relates to focusing people away from the past and moving towards the future. Looking at the communication patterns, really, really, really important. Paying attention to who's giving feedback, who's receiving feedback, who talks after who aligns with who, what systems or subsystems are developing. Is it brother and sister versus mom and dad, or is it mom and sister versus everyone? So it's looking at just kind of the language and who responds, and how they respond, and whether they support or whether they are direct opposites of each other. So those are important things to really pay attention to. And then also helping people give that feedback, positive feedback to one another as they need to, educating clients about that. Cultivating positive cognitive mindsets. And so really helping people kind of think, because sometimes it's easier just to be in a negative place, and really to help people really, in the grand scheme of things, look at a particular set of circumstances or an incident and realize that they're really not as major oftentimes as we build them up to be in our mind. So really helping people understand that particular concept. And then really starting to employ some of that positive cognitive sets as well. And then really helping folks with that giving and receiving of positive feedback, as well as acknowledging growth. So when you see people doing things different as you've worked with them, and give them credit for that incremental growth, because they're the ones doing the hard work. You're putting the ideas out and some of the resources and the plans, but they've got to be the ones who implement it and actually follow through. So just keeping those things in mind when we're thinking about communication. Also understanding that these are different strategies in terms of modifying interaction. So the meta communication is really listening to the conversation within the conversation. So oftentimes, communication can be a fairly inexact science, because oftentimes what people say isn't necessarily what they mean. And so it's about really helping your clients understand, as they're communicating, what are the hidden messages in the actual conversation that might be playing out, or we call it meta communication. So to really understand those and surface those as much as you possibly can. Also then modifying the family rules, because oftentimes families find themselves in this situation because of a history of rules that may have come from their parents or someone else's parents, and they're actually not working. So are there ways to look at what we can do to maintain the family structure, but do it a little bit different? Do we have to do it the way that our moms and dad did it? And maybe not, maybe so. On the spot interventions, really looking at focusing on the process rather than the content. Always remaining neutral in terms of your feedback. If you align yourself with one portion of the family and not the other, you do a great disservice, because then people are going to accuse you of taking sides. And so we want to always be as neutral as we possibly can, even when it's clear sometimes to us that we can see that the issues might be emanating from one particular place. But we'll get to that as we start to unpack and utilize some of the different techniques in terms of getting people to communicate and connect with each other. So again, oftentimes you'll hear shocking content, right at the end of a meeting, or, during the meeting, which, if you focus on the content and the drama, sometimes that's kind of impeded in it, it can take you off course and change your mode of thinking, as well as inhibit your ability to just kind of stay on track. So again, if we focus on the process, if we're going to start here and today's about getting this particular information, then I'll probably be less likely to respond to something that I hear that's dramatic, but I will continue on the process in terms of really trying to understand how that all, what that all means and how it works out. Assisting people in terms of resolving conflict, there's some great things that we talked about earlier on for you all as clinicians in terms of looking at different anger management techniques, looking at skills like assertive communication, looking at problem solving, and when is it okay to actually ignore a situation and when do you need to actually pay attention to it. So those are all things that you can teach clients in terms of modifying some of those particular behaviors that we are seeing. And then negotiate those agreements and modifying those complementary interactions. So those are all strategies that are going to be very helpful for us in terms of moving forward. Also modifying the misconceptions and the distorted perceptions. Oftentimes, families, individuals, people are a product of history. And so if we have gotten information from other parts of our family or our living situations or our environment that says that these are the things that are real and these are the things that are happening, then without the benefit oftentimes of evidence, people will just kind of continue to perpetuate that. And so it's about really looking at, in the context of the family, are the things that are happening for them, or are their perceptions or misconceptions a part of what's guiding some of the way that they connect with each other and communicate, and thereby creating issues. So it's about bringing those misconceptions into the open. It's about using empathy to address that ambiguity, because sometimes we just don't know. We're in that gray place, and it's okay for us to be in there, but it's about really helping people understand that, yeah, we get it, that it's hard, and that those are things that we need to work through. And then focusing on the process and not the client. So the moment we identify a client in this particular misconception, perception piece, then we do a disservice. And it's about staying focused on the process as opposed to staying focused on the client. Looking at then intervening with families and then aligning things differently. So after you've done some work in all of those particular facets in terms of looking at the communication styles and the patterns and the different things that you're going to do to intervene, then it's about how do we start to then develop these new alliances? How do we start to strengthen these underdeveloped relationships? How do we start to differentiate individuals from subsystems that are in a family? How do we increase family interactions in a positive and healthy way? Helping family members accommodate to the change in the circumstances. Remember, this is new for them. So it's going to take some time maybe for things to actually fall into place. And, in these instances, there are times where you actually have some setbacks, because if people have been conditioned and used to, operating a certain way for the last 15 years, then, 6 weeks worth of work with you as a social worker not going to change it all that dramatically. And so recognizing that it takes some time to do that and some practice in terms of the work that you're doing, as well as reinforcing those alliances as well too. So that brings to a close my section as it relates to enhancing family functioning. So as always, I'd encourage you to do your readings before you come to class. We will more than likely have an exercise in class that will help us practice what that looks like in real time. So I bid you a fair adieu until it's time to see you again in class. Take care.